any money spells. There's no work for money, there's no workings for any of that, because they didn't have money.
Interesting.
They had no reason for it.
Right.
So hence you don't find workings for it. And one of the other things that's important to note is that outside of New Orleans Conjure, you also don't find candle work, because they weren't allowed to have candles. Candles were a luxury of those who owned them.
Wow.
You know, there might have been work with light as a result of working with lamps, the fuel of which would have been something like lard. But you're not finding candle work outside of Louisiana and that whole kind of region. You know, folks to the east of them might have no idea about candle work. That was a luxury that they were not afforded.
Wow.
So I talked about Native Americans and that connection and influence there. Louisiana, since we've gotten to that. So New Orleans Conjure and so forth was directly influenced by the slaves that were brought there in 1804 with the revolution, with the Haitian Revolution. And going back to what I was saying earlier about how slaves in the island colonies and the Caribbean and so forth had more space and were given the permission to engage in their traditional or their ancestors' religion as opposed to those here on the continent, right? So when we had this influx of slaves that came to Louisiana in 1804 because of the revolution, they brought a lot of that knowledge with them, in addition to what they may have picked up from those who had enslaved them, you know, the French and Catholicism. So what this means is when they came here, they introduced the whole practice of vigils and candle work and all of that, because they were actually allowed to have that because of who their enslavers were, i.e. the French, Catholics, and so on. So they were allowed to engage in this practice, whereas no one else even knew about it. So that's one of the main things that came about as a result of those brought here from Haiti. Candle work. And because of their slavers' connection with Catholicism and Europeans. The altar, as we know it, influenced by them as well. So altar, candle work, incense, holy water, oils, all this came as a result of them being under the boot and the whips of Catholic masters and their religion. So this is something, these are elements that they then brought with them over here to America, and that's why you see that so often now in Hoodoo. None of that was an original part. I'm sure they had altars and things of that nature in however way that they could, but as we know it, and as it's practiced, and as you see today, sold in shops and so forth, that comes from that. That comes from these individuals that brought these elements over. And in Florida, right, these are things that you would never see. There would be some paraphernalia that would be similar, animals, insects, body parts, herbs, roots, and so on, but they wouldn't have known about using candles and oils and things of that nature, because they were here on the continent. Do y'all have any questions thus far about any of this? Okay. One of the other things about Hoodoo in America, speaking to its history, is songs, spirituals, you know, and how the songs that these slaves were singing out in the field, inside, you know, could have been code.
Interesting. Never thought about that.
Yeah. Yeah, using song as code, is using song as a form of communication about maybe someone was planning on an escape. Maybe someone had escaped and gotten away, and how you word that, you weave that into the form of a song. And everybody's singing, and the master's up there, and he's thinking it's just a bunch of
Nonsense.
Negroes. But in actuality, they're communicating with each other, and they're relaying a message. You see? And this is important. Clever. Yeah, and this speaks to also one of the most important elements of Hoodoo, besides the ancestors, is doing things in the open, right in front of someone, and them having no idea that you're working on them. You know, this is a pivotal element of Hoodoo, is being able to work out in the open, to be able to work in public and have people have no idea that you're getting work done.
It's like hiding in plain sight.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they didn't have a choice. They didn't have a choice, and this is one of the distinguishing factors that separates Hoodoo from many other spiritual, religious traditions, is the way in which you operate and engage the world around you, you know, and how you have got to learn, or your best to learn, how to do things in plain sight without anyone even knowing what it is you're up to.
I had a question back to the songs. You said that they could have been code.
Yeah.
Does that also go for like the songs sung in like the ATRs and the Spiritismo and stuff like that?
For those, it would have been, well, those songs and those traditions are different in that they didn't have to hide the meaning. You know, the meaning in the song in some of these, like a pataki or something like that, you know, the meaning would be up to the individual to understand what's behind the story. Whereas songs sung by these slaves, it wasn't about like, there wasn't some, or there may not have been some deeper religious meaning behind it, like some type of, like it's pointing to some spiritual mystery. You know what I mean? Here, it was a very practical, very immediate, like this is what's going on, this is what needs to be said, this is what we need to know or someone else needs to know, this is what we're up to, and this is how we're going to gather and so forth. You see? So whereas, you know, the songs from the traditions that you're talking about are beautiful songs, but nothing needs to be hidden. You know, whereas these, the message is implicitly hidden, because you couldn't have your enemy finding out. Does that make sense?
That would be bad.
Right, you know. So, but even speaking to the element of like let's say like there was a purely spiritual element. Like let's say that somebody was born. There had been some child that had been born, right? And so they couldn't sing what song they might have sung, which might have been one of those, right? Coming from an ATR. So instead, having to sing it in a way that still has some similar meaning to it.
Like a metaphorical kind of.
Yeah, metaphorical, and also call and response. You know what you see a lot of in the ATRs? So one person saying one line and then everyone else says these other lines. That's another thing you see in black churches and so on. That comes from this tradition.
Oh, interesting.
Call and response. Call and response. Right? So you have singing as code. You have singing as conveying messages. from one party to another, from one person to another, and so forth. And then you have underlying spiritual meanings.
It's very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and by spiritual meaning, they're not going to say, oh, they're not going to openly talk about, you know, Eshu or Ogun and so forth. They might replace it with the name of a saint or something, you know. Or if you got a bunch of women in the big house, them singing as they're cooking. And people, again, think they're looking at them as just a bunch of Negroes singing to themselves as they're cooking food. No, they're actually putting that energy into the meal based upon the meal itself. What's the purpose of the meal? Who's it for? And so forth. So they've hidden it in the song, and even the way in which they may be moving around and so forth. You see? Hiding things in the open. Hiding things in the open. Also, I wanted to pass these around before I forget. I don't know if any of y'all have ever held any of these, but this is cotton plant. Okay? And I wanted to bring these because I wanted you to see and I wanted you to feel what it is these people had to stick their fingers in, their hands in and day out, and what would cause their hands to bleed while they're picking cotton, those who are on cotton fields.
Wow.
Right? So I'm going to pass these around. Yeah, and feel the thorns on the side of that.
Wow.
They're like talons.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. Check that out. I picked those up from a botanical garden I was at recently, and I wanted to bring them for this class.
It's like from far away they look pretty, and then you touch them, you're like, never mind.
Yeah, that's right.
Wow. That's horrible.
Imagine that digging into your hands, into your fingers all day.
Wow.
And then chattel slavery, where people who were born from slaves are automatically slaves. Mm-hmm.
And they couldn't even do anything about it. They can't be like, I'm bleeding, I gotta take a break.
Right. Yeah, that's right. They wouldn't care. Actually, if you complain, you'd probably get beaten worse.
Yeah, you get whipped or something. Yeah.
Yeah, because they think you're trying to get out of work.
Right. Wow.
Songs. And one of the last parts about the songs I wanted to talk about was to give an example. There's a song called Swinging in the Spirit. And that song is about being mounted, which, being familiar with Santeria and so forth, you know about being mounted by spirits, or by a spirit specifically. And
Wait.
so, yes.
Did you say mounted?
Yeah, mounted. Mounted is when someone is literally mounted
Yeah.
by a spirit. And it's said that they come up from the earth or out of the earth, at least depending on those that you work, depending on which ones you're working with.
Mm.
Or you may not be working with, who may just be attracted to you and you are open and they hop in the saddle. You're a horse. They use the illustration of a horse and you've been mounted. The song Swinging in the Spirit is an example of talking about that or facilitating that. Storytelling being another important element of Hoodoo culture. Hoodoo religion, Hoodoo tradition.
Storytelling is in your ancestors telling you stories and they're telling you
Yeah,
about...
exactly, the oral tradition. That element, you know, Hoodoo coming from the ATRs has a very strong oral element to it. You know, stories from mouth to ear being passed down. You know, history, knowledge, and so what were you going to write it on anyway? You know, I mean, before that was just part of the tradition. Besides those cultures or nations in Africa that wrote things down, such as the Comedics and so on. But here, you definitely had nothing else to put it down on,
That's true. I
right?
never thought about that.
So then their power of memory really came into place. You see? So yes, strong oral culture, storytelling, teaching stories, you know, everything that comes along with that. And one form of teaching stories that there existed was in the form of Briar Rabbit. And Briar Rabbit is this character really kind of akin to like a Bugs Bunny or something like that. He was very mischievous, you know, always into shit, you know, fucking with somebody and like getting away with it. You know, Briar Rabbit. And so Briar Rabbit, which comes out of the Gullah culture as well. How would they pronounce it? Brer Rabbit. I think they pronounce it Brer Rabbit. And those are teaching stories that you can read and it's like, oh, this is just some children's story, right? It's like a bedtime story or something. But there's elements of hoodoo hidden within it. And when you know how to take it apart, you see how they're teaching you about different works and so on. And how you can pull tricks on somebody. You know, Brer Rabbit is those stories are very good at teaching you about not when someone's laying a trick on you or how you may be able to do it with someone else. You know, it teaches you about when somebody's fucking with you or trying to deceive you. You know, it's very good at that. So Brer Rabbit being one kind of main example that I can point to of storytelling that is on its face value is just some children's story, but actually has way deeper values and techniques that it can lend to an individual, to a practitioner specifically. Plat Eye, spelled P-L-A-T -I, is something you hear about in Hoodoo, and Plat Eye is this red-eyed demon that's talked about, and it's distinguishing